I was just setting the Christmas table with my husband and kids when my mother-in-law stormed in, holding a dusty envelope she called very important for the family. My heart sank as she smirked, saying, "I hid the will from you all for a reason." That's when I discovered she had secretly changed my father-in-law's inheritance to favor herself and my brother-in-law, but what she didn't know was that I had already copied the real will. In that moment, I realized I could finally turn her lies against her, and the look on her face when she saw me smiling was priceless. It all started on a quiet Sunday morning in our suburban home, the kind of morning where the sunlight streams lazily through the half-open curtains, casting golden streaks across the kitchen tiles. I was in the kitchen, carefully arranging plates for breakfast, making sure everything was just right. My husband, Mark, was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, pretending to be casual, but his brow furrowed slightly every time he noticed my mother-in-law's shadowy presence just outside the window. Our kids, Emily and little Jake, were busy with their morning cartoons, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing in the background. From the moment I married Mark, I knew that life with my mother-in-law, Margaret, would be complicated, but I had no idea how complex it could truly get. Margaret was a woman who demanded attention, even when she tried to appear polite. She had a way of inserting herself into our lives with subtle comments, small criticisms wrapped in a smile, and unexpected visits that disrupted the fragile balance of our family. She often claimed it was all for the family's good, but over the years, it became painfully clear that her definition of good rarely included anyone but herself. Even in these seemingly calm moments, the tension in our household was palpable. Margaret had a way of making ordinary conversations feel like examinations, always judging, always watching, always ready to pounce on any perceived weakness. When she visited, it was never just a simple visit, it was an event. Every corner of our home seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were bracing for her presence. The way she scrutinized my cooking, the way she commented on Mark's work schedule, the way she casually mentioned family secrets during small talk, it all created an invisible web of anxiety that we, her family, couldn't escape. Despite this, there was also a strange rhythm to our lives, a kind of dance we performed whenever she was around. Mark would attempt diplomacy, smiling politely while nodding at her endless critiques. I, as the daughter-in-law, had to navigate carefully, balancing respect with subtle resistance, learning to choose my battles wisely. Emily and Jake were old enough to notice the tension, but young enough to be spared the full weight of it. They would giggle and play in the corner, occasionally glancing at Margaret with curiosity, unaware that behind her gentle exterior lay manipulation and control. Our household was a microcosm of conflicting emotions: love, loyalty, fear, frustration, and hope. Every member of our family had learned to adapt in their own way. Mark, torn between love for his mother and his loyalty to me, often felt trapped in a tug-of-war that left him exhausted. I had become both protector and strategist, constantly analyzing every word, every glance, every gesture from Margaret, preparing for whatever subtle attack might come next. And our children, innocent yet perceptive, absorbed the tension like sponges, learning early the nuances of family diplomacy. One of the most challenging aspects of this family dynamic was the constant, underlying thread of secrets and lies. Margaret had a history of exaggerating, bending the truth, and occasionally fabricating stories to position herself as the ultimate authority in our family. These weren't just harmless fibs, they were carefully crafted narratives designed to manipulate situations and people, ensuring that she always came out ahead. I had learned to recognize the patterns, to read between the lines, but the emotional toll of constantly questioning what was real and what was deception was exhausting. Even routine days carried the weight of her influence. A simple grocery run could turn into a subtle interrogation. "Are you buying enough for the family?" she might ask, in a tone that suggested she had the right to know every detail of our private life. A conversation about our children's school could shift into a critique of our parenting choices. Every interaction with her was layered with double meanings, leaving me constantly alert, constantly calculating, and always on edge. Yet, amidst all this, there was also a deep-seated determination within me. I refused to let Margaret's manipulations define the atmosphere in our home or dictate the happiness of my family. Over time, I became vigilant, learning to anticipate her moves, preparing myself for the day when I could finally turn the tables. There was a quiet strength in me that Margaret had underestimated, one that would eventually allow me to take control, not with aggression, but with strategy, intelligence, and patience. Our family dynamic, therefore, was a delicate balance of tension and resilience. It was shaped not only by the love we shared, but also by the conflicts we endured. Every glance, every word, every unspoken emotion contributed to a complex tapestry that defined our lives together. I learned early that surviving, and eventually thriving, meant understanding Margaret not just as a mother-in-law, but as a formidable opponent in the intricate game of family power and loyalty. Looking back, I realized that these early mornings, these small, seemingly mundane moments, were setting the stage for something much larger. The quiet tension of our daily lives, the subtle battles of words and wills, the constant dance of respect and resistance, all of it was preparing me for a moment when truth and justice could finally be revealed. And while the children played innocently, and Mark sipped his coffee in silent contemplation, I already sensed that the next chapter of our family story would be unforgettable, dramatic, and completely transformative. Because in the heart of every family lies both love and conflict, and in our house, the shadow of my mother-in-law was long, but it would not be eternal. Little did Margaret know, every manipulation, every hidden comment, and every smirk she had ever thrown my way had been noticed, analyzed, and stored in the quiet corners of my mind. And when the right moment came, I would have the power to change everything. I can still remember that day as if it were painted in the richest colors, every detail etched into my memory with an almost cinematic clarity. The morning sun poured gently over the rose-colored walls of my childhood home, but my heart felt anything but calm. I was surrounded by the flurry of wedding preparations, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted the lace on my gown, feeling the weight of the day settle over me like an invisible cloak. My mother-in-law, Margaret, was not yet in attendance, but her looming presence had been felt for weeks. Invitations had been scrutinized, guest lists manipulated, and seating arrangements subtly altered, all under the guise of family tradition and attention to detail. I knew, even then, that this wedding was not just a celebration of love, it was a battlefield, and Margaret was already claiming the high ground. Walking down the aisle felt surreal, a mix of joy, anticipation, and a creeping anxiety that no bridal makeup could conceal. Mark stood at the altar, smiling nervously, clearly unaware of just how much tension his mother had seeded in the air. Behind him, I could see glimpses of the mother-in-law I had come to know so well, elegant, polished, seemingly benevolent, but with eyes sharp as knives. Every glance she cast, every small smile, felt like a calculated move in a game I hadn't yet learned the rules of. She had this uncanny ability to command attention without saying a word, and even amid the music, flowers, and laughter, she radiated control. The ceremony itself was beautiful on the surface. Soft organ music filled the chapel, the scent of fresh lilies and roses hung in the air, and my friends and family beamed at us with genuine happiness. Yet, beneath the laughter and congratulations, I felt the subtle currents of judgment, whispering doubts, and the quiet scrutiny of Margaret. She had always found a way to make everyone feel slightly off balance, and that day was no exception. When she leaned slightly to whisper to one of my in-laws, I caught the words, just enough to sense her influence. I told them how it should be done. Her tone was sweet, almost maternal, but the underlying dominance was unmistakable. As I reached the center of the aisle, the memories of the months leading up to the wedding came flooding back. Hours spent choosing dresses, planning menus, and most excruciatingly, navigating Margaret's endless commentary. Every suggestion she made seemed innocent on the surface, yet carefully calculated to shift attention to her and subtly undermine my choices. The flowers, the seating, the music, even the very color scheme of the wedding, was scrutinized and subtly criticized, though she framed it as guidance. My friends whispered words of comfort. "Don't let her get to you." But the truth was, it wasn't just about getting to me. It was about asserting her dominance, about making this day as much about her as it was about us. The reception that followed was a delicate dance of smiles, polite conversations, and hidden frustrations. Margaret floated from table to table, her laughter ringing out, always just loud enough to dominate the room without seeming intrusive. She complimented the cake, the music, even my own dress, but there was always a layer of criticism hidden beneath her words. "Oh, the flowers are lovely, but perhaps they'd be better in a taller vase, don't you think?" she said, in that sweet, measured tone that suggested generosity but masked control. Every compliment was a test, every suggestion a subtle power move, and every smile a challenge I could feel in my chest. Mark seemed oblivious to the subtle power play, laughing along and taking her suggestions in stride, but I could see the tension it created in our small circle. My father-in-law tried to keep peace, offering gentle smiles and quiet reassurances, but the undertone was undeniable. The wedding had become not only a union of two people but a stage for family politics, a carefully orchestrated performance in which Margaret insisted on playing the lead role. Every toast, every dance, and every photograph became a negotiation of influence, an unspoken dialogue of dominance and submission. It wasn't just the adults who felt the weight of her presence. Emily and Jake, well, they weren't born yet at that point, but watching cousins and younger relatives interact, I could already see how children became unwitting pawns in Margaret's subtle games. She had this remarkable ability to make her attention seem generous while subtly undermining others. I realized that the smallest smile, the tiniest gesture, could be interpreted as approval or dismissal, and she wielded the skill like a masterful general directing a battlefield. By the end of the day, I was emotionally exhausted, my hands sore from holding bouquets and adjusting my dress, my smile locked in place as I posed for photographs. Mark was radiant, of course, blissfully unaware of the silent wars being waged around us. The guests celebrated, danced, and feasted, while I felt the invisible chains of Margaret's scrutiny tightening around me. She was everywhere, yet nowhere, a shadow that colored the happiest day of my life with an undertone of tension and unease. That evening, as we left the reception, I remember the quiet ride back to our first home as a married couple. Mark was talking animatedly about the fun and joy of the day, and I smiled, but inside, I was plotting, analyzing, and remembering every slight, every smirk, every subtle manipulation. I vowed, silently, that no matter how skilled she was at controlling appearances, one day, the truth would shine through, and her lies would be her undoing. That wedding had not just united Mark and me, it had also revealed the battlefield I would have to navigate for years to come. And looking back now, with the envelope, the manipulated will, and the Christmas dinner looming on the horizon, I realized that everything Margaret did that day, the subtle critiques, the strategic compliments, the careful positioning of herself as the family's matriarch, was just practice for the ultimate game she thought she controlled. Little did she know, I had been learning, observing, and preparing, and the lessons of that wedding day would guide me when the moment of truth finally arrived. Every tense glance, every whispered suggestion, and every strategic compliment from that day had been a rehearsal for the exact moment I would turn her lies against her, and Christmas dinner would be the stage. After the whirlwind of the wedding had settled, I thought the tension with my mother-in-law Margaret might ease. I had hoped that perhaps the celebrations would give way to a more peaceful dynamic, a chance for her to step back and allow us to live our lives as a newly married couple. But almost immediately, the subtle hints of deception began to surface, little threads of unease that quickly wove themselves into the fabric of our daily life. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small inconsistencies, comments that didn't quite add up, and an underlying sense that Margaret was never entirely truthful, even in her most benign interactions. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. We were discussing family finances over coffee one morning, a seemingly innocent conversation about upcoming bills and household budgets. Margaret, who had come over under the pretense of helping, casually mentioned, "Oh, I thought the savings were in this account, but maybe I misremembered." At first, I laughed it off, assuming it was a simple mistake. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "I wouldn't want anyone to make the wrong decisions because they didn't listen to me." That statement, though softly spoken, carried an invisible weight of authority and manipulation, a quiet attempt to establish control over decisions that were no longer hers to make. It was around this time that I began to notice patterns. Invitations to family events would come with subtle conditions. Letters and emails from relatives would mysteriously omit certain details unless Margaret had approved them, and casual conversations often contained half-truths designed to sway opinions. One afternoon, While helping her organize a stack of old family documents, I found a letter addressed to my husband, Mark, from his father, carefully folded and placed in a drawer. Margaret had clearly reviewed it first. I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach as I realized how much of our family's information passed through her hands before reaching us. It was not merely meddling. It was a calculated filtering of knowledge, a distortion of reality, and a form of silent control. The deception extended beyond words and documents. I began to notice how Margaret would subtly manipulate people around her. At social gatherings, she would offer compliments that carried veiled critiques. "Oh, your dress is lovely, but perhaps a little more understated would suit the occasion." She would tell stories about family members that were only partially true, inserting herself as the central figure of moral authority. She seemed to take perverse pleasure in observing the reactions of others, like a chess player watching pieces move according to her plan. I could see her glances, quick, calculating, measuring, not directed at anything as simple as affection, but as if she were testing loyalty, obedience, and compliance. One of the most unsettling moments occurred during a quiet evening at home when Mark and I were reviewing old family photographs. Margaret, who had been visiting unannounced, as was her habit, leaned over to comment on a picture of Mark as a child. "Did you know," she said slowly, "that your father wanted to leave certain things to you? But, well, it's complicated." Her tone was light, almost casual, but the ambiguity and deliberate withholding of information set off alarm bells in my mind. Why would she speak in riddles about inheritance? What secrets was she keeping? That night, I lay awake, replaying her words, analyzing her tone, and realizing for the first time how much power she had quietly amassed over family knowledge. Margaret's ability to deceive was not just about facts or events, it was about perception. She shaped reality by controlling what others believed to be true. For example, family gatherings became exercises in observation. She would praise one child while subtly undermining another, all under the guise of encouragement. She would relay stories from relatives, twisting them just enough to plant doubt or elevate her own position. These were not random acts. They were carefully orchestrated strategies designed to influence behavior and maintain authority within the family. I also noticed that the deception had emotional consequences. My husband, Mark, would sometimes question his own memories, uncertain whether he had forgotten certain family decisions or whether Margaret's version of events was accurate. I, as the daughter-in-law, found myself constantly parsing every word she spoke, weighing what was true against what might be a fabrication. The children, too, absorbed these dynamics, often unconsciously mirroring the tension they sensed. The household began to feel like a stage, where Margaret controlled the script and everyone else was expected to play along. Perhaps the most subtle yet impactful example of her deception was how she used gifts and gestures to manipulate perception. On one occasion, she brought over a family heirloom, a delicate necklace that had belonged to Mark's grandmother. She presented it with an elaborate story, claiming she had just remembered its significance. Later, I discovered discrepancies in her version of events. Dates didn't match, the recipient she named had never owned it, and some details were entirely fabricated. Yet, in the moment, she had created a sense of gratitude and obligation, cleverly binding us emotionally to her narrative while cementing her own importance. It became clear that Margaret's deceptions were layered. There was the surface-level charm, the polite smile, the apparent interest in family welfare. Beneath that lay a network of distortions designed to manipulate outcomes, financial, emotional, and relational. Every interaction was a test, every word a potential trap, and every gesture carried the weight of hidden intentions. As a daughter-in-law, I realized that navigating this web required vigilance, strategy, and emotional resilience. I began documenting her actions, noting inconsistencies, and observing patterns, like a detective piecing together a subtle but undeniable puzzle. By the time the children were in bed and the house quiet, I often reflected on these early hints of deception, wondering how far Margaret's manipulations would go and what lengths she would take to maintain control. I knew that recognizing the patterns was only the first step. If I wanted to protect my family and ensure justice, I had to act strategically. The seeds of vigilance and foresight were planted here, in these quiet, tension-filled evenings where the smallest details revealed the depth of her duplicity. And yet, even amidst the frustration and emotional strain, I also felt a growing sense of empowerment. Understanding the deception gave me tools to respond, to prepare, and eventually to turn the tables. The seemingly minor lies and manipulations of those early months were, in fact, training for the moment when truth would confront deceit, when the curtain would rise, and Margaret's control would be challenged in a way she could never anticipate. Every misplaced comment, every cryptic story, every veiled criticism was a piece of a larger puzzle. And as I quietly observed, documented, and planned, I realized that the very tools Margaret used to manipulate the family could one day become the instruments of her own unraveling. It was an awakening, a realization that the power of truth, when wielded carefully, could outmatch the most calculated deception. That understanding would guide every step I took, every word I spoke, and every action I planned, leading toward the ultimate revelation, one that would take place at Christmas dinner, when her lies would finally collide with reality in a way that none of us would forget. The first hint of snow had dusted our neighborhood streets, and the scent of pine trees mixed with the crisp winter air as I began the Christmas preparations. It should have been a joyful time, a season for warmth, laughter, and family, but in our house, even the holidays carried a subtle tension, thanks to my mother-in-law Margaret. Her presence was never far, even when she wasn't physically there. The mere thought of her unexpected visits sent a ripple of anxiety through the otherwise festive air. I had learned over the years that Christmas was not just a holiday, it was a test, a stage where family dynamics could shift in a single remark, and where Margaret's carefully honed manipulations often reached their peak. I started early that morning, arranging ornaments on our towering Christmas tree with Mark and the kids by my side. Emily and little Jake giggled as they struggled to place the glittering baubles in the perfect spot, their laughter echoing through the living room. Mark, usually calm and collected, seemed unusually tense, constantly glancing at the front door as if expecting Margaret to appear at any moment with one of her cryptic smiles. The children were blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes, but I could feel it, a weight in the air, a quiet warning that no matter how carefully we decorated, no detail would escape her scrutiny if she showed up. I had prepared meticulously, each ornament, each candle, and each garland positioned with purpose. The dining table was set with our finest china, red and gold accents reflecting the warm glow of the fireplace. Everything was arranged to create an inviting, celebratory atmosphere, yet every placement had a secret layer of strategy. I wasn't just decorating, I was creating a stage. Each seat at the table, each ornament, even the placement of the silverware, had been carefully considered to anticipate Margaret's potential criticisms and to subtly reclaim control over the family narrative. As I hung the final strand of twinkling lights around the tree, I thought back to previous Christmases, when Margaret had arrived unannounced, her opinions spilling over like an unstoppable flood. "Oh, I think the tree should be taller," she had said one year, her voice sweet, yet laced with authority. Another year, she insisted that our stockings were all wrong, and that the presents were arranged in a manner that didn't reflect the family hierarchy. These weren't just comments. They were lessons in manipulation, a display of power dressed as tradition. This year, I was determined to prevent her from undermining our celebration. I moved on to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. Sugar and cinnamon clung to every surface, dusting my apron like a gentle snow. Emily helped roll dough into tiny stars, while Jake carefully sprinkled sugar over each one, trying not to spill too much. Mark chopped nuts for the stuffing, his brow furrowed as he occasionally glanced toward the door, a subtle reminder that Margaret could walk in at any moment and disrupt the delicate balance of our household. Every corner of the kitchen seemed alive with anticipation, every sound magnified in the quiet tension that had become second nature to our family. Meanwhile, I double-checked the invitations for our extended family Christmas dinner. Margaret had always found a way to manipulate seating arrangements, subtly positioning herself to dominate conversations or shift attention to her preferred topics. I meticulously planned where everyone would sit, aiming to diffuse potential confrontations before they could arise. I wanted the evening to be joyous for our children, for Mark, and for me, but I knew that Margaret's presence, if not carefully managed, could turn the night into another subtle battlefield of manipulation and control. The decorations in the living room were not just aesthetic choices. They were symbols of strategy and emotional positioning. Red ribbons, warm candlelight, and gold accents were chosen not only for beauty but to evoke feelings of comfort, celebration, and subtle authority in my home. I arranged the ornaments to catch the eye, drawing attention away from any minor imperfections, a silent declaration that our space was ours to manage. The fireplace mantel was adorned with family photos, carefully framed to highlight moments of joy and togetherness, while also reminding Margaret that this household was built on love, not control. As I prepared the gift table, I thought about the roles each person would play. Margaret had a tendency to twist even simple gestures, using gifts as tools of influence. She might comment on a present, framing her opinion as wisdom, but often planting seeds of guilt or obligation. This year, I strategically placed the gifts, ensuring that each was presented in a way that minimized her ability to manipulate perception. I wanted to celebrate generosity and thoughtfulness, but I also wanted to protect the integrity of our family's joy. Even the smallest details mattered. The placement of the centerpiece, the alignment of napkins, and the direction of the chair backs were all elements I adjusted to maintain harmony. Each adjustment was an exercise in anticipation, imagining Margaret's potential criticisms and neutralizing them before they could surface. It was exhausting, but necessary. I knew that the peace of our home depended on the careful orchestration of the environment, a quiet assertion of control that she could not easily undermine. The day wore on with a rhythm that balanced preparation and anticipation. The aroma of roasted vegetables, cinnamon, and pine mingled in the air, creating a sensory tapestry that was both comforting and tense. I found moments of reflection amid the busyness, considering how much effort it had taken to maintain peace in our home and how much skill Margaret had in creating tension without overt confrontation. I realized that understanding her behavior, predicting her moves, and strategically positioning myself and my family were not just exercises in patience, they were essential skills in protecting the emotional well-being of our household. Mark tried to ease the tension with small jokes, nudging the kids to hang an ornament slightly crooked to make them laugh. Their laughter was a balm, a reminder of what was truly important. But even in these moments, I could feel the undercurrent of vigilance, the quiet awareness that Margaret could arrive at any second, potentially changing the course of the evening with one well-timed comment, one smile, one seemingly innocent question. By late afternoon, the house was transformed into a warm, inviting space, ready for the family dinner. The tree sparkled, the candles flickered, and the table gleamed. The children's excitement bubbled over, a counterpoint to the tension that lingered in the adult world. I paused to take in the scene, feeling a mix of satisfaction, anxiety, and determination. Everything was in place, yet I knew that the true test of our preparation would come when Margaret walked through the door. And then, as I adjusted the final ornament and smoothed the tablecloth, I heard the faint crunch of snow outside. My heart skipped a beat. I knew immediately that it was her, the mother-in-law whose lies, manipulations, and subtle power plays had shaped so many of our family moments. The Christmas preparations, every careful decision, every strategic placement, were now about to meet their ultimate challenge. I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and reminded myself that this year I was ready. This Christmas, our family celebration would no longer be dominated by fear or manipulation. The stage was set, the players were in position, and soon the truth would have its moment. The late afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across our living room, when the familiar crunch of snow outside sent a jolt of anticipation through me. My fingers, busy arranging the final touches on the Christmas table, paused mid-motion as the unmistakable sound of footsteps approached the front door. I knew immediately Margaret, my mother-in-law, had arrived. Even without looking, I could feel her presence looming over the room, as if the air itself carried her energy before she crossed the threshold. The smell of pine from the wreath on the door mingled with the lingering aroma of cinnamon and roasted vegetables, creating a sensory tension that seemed almost theatrical, like a storm about to break in slow motion. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and reminded myself that this Christmas I was prepared. Every corner of the living room had been carefully arranged, every decoration chosen to diffuse potential confrontation. The dining table gleamed under the soft glow of candlelight, ornaments shimmered from the Christmas tree, and the fire crackled with warmth. Yet, Despite the beauty and harmony of the preparations, a subtle undercurrent of anxiety pulsed through me. Margaret had a way of turning ordinary moments into high-stakes emotional battles, and I knew that the moment she stepped through that door, our carefully orchestrated calm would be tested to its limits. The doorbell rang, crisp and deliberate, breaking the stillness like a drumbeat in a tense symphony. Mark glanced toward me, with a mixture of anticipation and unease, his hand brushing over Emily's hair as she sat at the table, wide-eyed and unaware of the impending storm. Jake clutched a small toy, sensing the energy in the room, his instincts as a child attuned to the subtle cues of adult tension. I walked to the door, each step deliberate, as if preparing to face not just a visitor but a formidable adversary whose very presence commanded attention. When I opened the door, there she was, Margaret, standing tall in a deep green coat, her signature pearls glinting in the late afternoon light. Her expression was a carefully crafted mask of cheer, but her eyes betrayed the sharp intelligence and subtle cunning I had come to recognize over the years. She held a dusty, worn envelope in one hand, as if it were a ceremonial prop announcing the arrival of a long-kept secret. The children stared, fascinated by her elegance, while Mark and I exchanged a knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of the tension she carried into our home. Margaret's smile was slow, deliberate, and slightly smug. "Merry Christmas!" she announced, her voice smooth, almost sing-song, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've brought something very important for the family," she added, waving the envelope ever so slightly. My stomach sank as I realized what it was, the very symbol of her manipulations and control, a relic that held the power to unsettle the harmony of our carefully prepared Christmas. She had chosen this moment, after all our preparation, to introduce her drama, as if the timing alone would amplify its impact. As she stepped inside, the subtle shift in the room was immediate. Her coat brushed against the furniture, her movements commanding the space without aggression, and everyone seemed to momentarily hold their breath. Margaret had always known how to enter a room in a way that dominated attention, drawing eyes, thoughts, and emotions toward her. I observed her carefully, noting the way she positioned herself, the way she held the envelope like a talisman, and the way her eyes flicked between Mark, me, and the children, as if gauging our reactions before deciding her next move. "Did I arrive at the right time?" she asked, voice laced with feigned innocence, though I recognized the calculated undertone. "I wouldn't want to interrupt, but this is far too important to wait." She set the envelope down on the edge of the dining table, her fingers brushing over the polished wood in a display of subtle ownership. Emily's eyes widened in curiosity, while Jake leaned slightly forward, sensing the drama that even children can perceive in the rhythm of adult tension. Mark, attempting calm, smiled politely, but his hand brushed mine under the table, a silent reassurance that we were united in facing whatever was about to unfold. Margaret's presence carried an almost theatrical weight. Every step she took, every gesture, every tilt of her head seemed rehearsed to perfection. She surveyed the decorations, commenting on the tree, the candles, the centerpiece, all in tones that suggested approval while simultaneously asserting her influence. "The tree is lovely," she said, pausing just long enough to draw attention to the subtle imperfections she had already noted in her mind. "But perhaps the lights could be a bit brighter, don't you think?" Her words, delivered with a sugar-coated edge, were classic Margaret, compliments wrapped in quiet criticism, a reminder of the control she liked to wield. I forced a smile, a careful mask of composure, while internally, every instinct screamed that this was the moment to stay vigilant. Margaret thrived on disruption, and the slightest crack in my calm could become an opening for her subtle manipulations. I reminded myself that everything I had done, every strategic placement of ornaments, every carefully chosen seat at the table, every arrangement of gifts, had been calculated to protect the family's peace and to maintain control over the narrative. This was the moment when all that preparation would be tested. Margaret's gaze shifted to the children, her voice softening, but not entirely relinquishing its underlying authority. "Emily, Jake, are you excited for Christmas?" she asked, leaning slightly to place a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. The gesture was sweet, almost maternal, yet I could see the flicker of calculation behind her eyes. She was charming, persuasive, and utterly aware of the emotional dynamics in the room. Even at this moment, she sought to establish dominance, subtly reminding everyone of her position within the family hierarchy. As she finally turned her attention to me, her smile widened ever so slightly. "And you," she said, voice gentle but deliberate, "you've done quite a job here. Everything looks perfect." I could feel the tension coil in the room like a spring. Her words were both a compliment and a challenge, a subtle acknowledgement of my efforts while implying that perfection was still subject to her approval. This was Margaret at her most formidable, gracious, poised, and infinitely controlling. The envelope she carried now rested on the table like a ticking time bomb. I knew, even before she spoke again, that its contents could unsettle the evening, stir old conflicts, and create waves of emotional tension. Margaret's timing was deliberate. The moment she crossed the threshold, the narrative of the evening shifted, and I could sense the quiet power struggle that would soon unfold. Every move, every glance, every breath now carried meaning, and the air in our home felt charged with anticipation, a mix of excitement, dread, and the unspoken promise that the family's equilibrium was about to be tested. And in that instant, as the children continued to chatter innocently, and Mark tried to maintain calm composure, I understood fully that the Christmas preparations, the hours of meticulous effort, the strategic placement of every ornament and every gift, had led to this exact moment. Margaret's arrival was not merely physical, it was an emotional intrusion, a subtle declaration of intent. And as I looked at her, holding the envelope like a crown, I realized that the evening's events were now beyond her control. If I played my cards right, the truth, long concealed, would soon find its way into the light. The tension was almost unbearable. Every second stretched, every movement amplified, as Margaret's eyes flicked around the room, measuring, assessing, and calculating. And then, she smiled again, the kind of smile that promised intrigue, conflict, and revelations. The stage was set, the players were in place, and Christmas dinner, the night that should have been filled with laughter and warmth, was about to become the arena where her lies and my quiet preparation would collide in ways no one could have anticipated. The room was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The warm glow of the Christmas lights cast a golden hue over the table, the fire flickered gently in the hearth, and the aroma of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh pine filled the air. Everything was calm on the surface, but beneath it, tension coiled like a spring, ready to release the moment Margaret decided to act. She had been standing near the envelope all this time, her gloved hands resting lightly on the polished wood, her smile perfectly measured, her eyes flickering with that quiet calculation that always made my stomach tighten. I could feel it! Margaret was preparing to drop a bomb, and the air itself seemed to bristle in anticipation. Then she spoke. Her voice, soft and sweet, carried through the room like a melody, but the words that followed cut through it like a knife. "I hid the will from you all for a reason," she announced, her tone casual, as if discussing the weather, yet heavy with implication. The children froze mid-bite, their eyes widening as Emily's grip on her fork tightened. Jake's small hands fell to the table, a little frown creasing his brow as he sensed the tension. Mark's face went pale, his jaw tightening as he leaned slightly forward, a mixture of shock and disbelief flashing in his eyes. And I felt my heart hammering against my chest, my mind racing through everything I had prepared, every detail I had set in place, every small observation I had made over the years about Margaret's behavior. Her announcement sent a ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, like the first tremor before an earthquake. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, the smug confidence, the way she held the envelope as though it were a crown she had won. "Yes," she continued, her lips curving into a small, self-satisfied smile. "I thought it was better for everyone if I controlled how this family handled the inheritance. After all, someone has to make sure it's done correctly." She glanced at Mark, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of control, then at me, as if daring me to challenge her authority. I remember the exact way the room shifted in that instant. The children's innocent excitement collided with the gravity of her words. Emily looked up at me with wide eyes, sensing both confusion and concern. Jake, though younger, seemed to intuit the weight of the revelation, his small body stiffening as if bracing for the impact of the truth. Mark's hands gripped the edge of a table, knuckles white, his mind racing to process the betrayal laid out so casually before us. And Margaret, oblivious to the storm her words had unleashed, leaned slightly forward, enjoying the effect of her dramatic disclosure. Her statement carried layers of manipulation. On the surface, it was about a legal document, a will, something cold and factual. But beneath it lay the emotional leverage she had carefully cultivated over decades. She was asserting dominance, instilling fear, and subtly attempting to shame us for our supposed ignorance. Every syllable was carefully chosen to make it clear that she had power, that she was in control, and that anyone who challenged her might face consequences. I felt a surge of emotions at once: anger, disbelief, indignation, and an almost primal drive to protect my family. This wasn't just about a piece of paper. It was about respect, justice, and the invisible but potent bonds of family loyalty. Margaret had overstepped in a way that cut to the core. Her manipulation had finally reached its peak, and yet, in her confidence, she underestimated one thing. I had anticipated her moves. I had observed, documented, and prepared for the moment when her deception would be revealed. "Margaret," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me, "what exactly do you mean by that?" My tone was neutral, but there was an undercurrent of warning, a subtle signal that her smug performance would not go unchallenged. She smiled, tilting her head slightly, as if to say she expected no resistance, as if she assumed the room would bend under the weight of her words. But I could see the faint flicker of curiosity in her expression. My calm had caught her off guard, and for a moment, the control she relied on felt just slightly unsteady. She opened the envelope with exaggerated care, pulling out a single sheet of paper. Her fingers trembled just slightly, though she masked it instantly with practiced elegance. "This," she said, her eyes glinting with triumph, "is the true direction of the inheritance. It favors me and your brother-in-law, naturally, because I've always known what's best for this family." She paused, letting her words hang in the air like a challenge. The room was silent, except for the faint crackling of the fire and the soft, almost imperceptible breathing of the children. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. At that moment, I realized the depth of her audacity. She had carefully rewritten history, or at least attempted to, hoping to control not only the present but also the legacy of the family. She assumed that her authority and cunning would protect her from discovery. But what she didn't know was that I had already obtained a copy of the Real will, a faithful record of my father-in-law's intentions. The truth was in my hands, and Margaret had no idea that her carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Emily's small hand slipped into mine, seeking comfort, while Jake clutched a napkin, his eyes wide as he tried to understand the seriousness in the adult's expressions. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his body tense with a mixture of shock, rage, and the dawning realization that his mother had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. And Margaret! Oh, Margaret! She was still smiling, completely confident that the envelope alone gave her control. Her smirk was a shield, a mask, a declaration of victory, yet it was fragile, precarious, and utterly dependent on the ignorance of those around her. I forced myself to stay calm, to let the tension build just enough for the moment of revelation to hit its peak. "That's interesting," I said, my tone casual, almost teasing, though every fiber of me was alert. "Because I happen to have a copy of the original will." I didn't need to say more. The words themselves carried a weight, a quiet promise that the game had changed, and that the ultimate power of truth was now in my hands. Margaret froze, her eyes widening, her smug smile faltering just slightly. The envelope she had held like a scepter suddenly seemed fragile in her hands. The room was charged with electric tension, a perfect storm of expectation, betrayal, and anticipation. The children watched, puzzled but sensing the emotional charge. Mark's jaw clenched as he leaned closer, and I felt the satisfaction of preparation meeting opportunity. It was a moment suspended in time, a turning point. Margaret's shocking statement had been intended to assert dominance, to manipulate, to unsettle us all. But what she didn't realize was that her own deceit had set the stage for her undoing. The room seemed to pulse with possibility, with a sense that something long concealed was about to emerge. And in that instant, I understood fully that Christmas dinner would not be ordinary. It would be the night when truth, carefully guarded and meticulously prepared, collided with deception, forever altering the balance of our family. Margaret's smug confidence still lingered in the air, heavy and almost tangible, like a shadow clinging to every corner of the room. The children, Emily and Jake, sensed the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Their wide eyes shifted between us adults, their small hands gripping the edges of their chairs, frozen mid-motion, as if they too were bracing for the storm. Mark's face was pale, jaw tight, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. And there she was, Margaret, still clutching the envelope she believed held ultimate power, smiling as if victory were already hers. But I could feel the shift, subtle yet undeniable. I had waited years for this moment, studied her moves, anticipated her words, and quietly collected the evidence I needed to expose her deception. The time had finally come to confront the lie. I picked up the envelope she had laid on the table so confidently, letting my fingers brush over the worn edges. "You know, Margaret," I said slowly, my voice calm, steady, and deceptively casual. "It's fascinating how careful one must be when altering documents. Such small changes can make a huge difference. It's almost artistic." I placed the envelope down deliberately, pausing just enough to make her uncertainty flicker in the corners of her eyes. She tilted her head, unsure, sensing that the ground beneath her authority was subtly shifting. The firelight reflected off her pearls, catching just the slightest glint, as if even the ornaments themselves were watching this confrontation unfold. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the real copy of the will, the one I had quietly obtained weeks ago during Margaret's busy distractions. My hands, though steady, carry the weight of years of preparation, observation, and silent strategizing. I unfolded it slowly, letting the paper crackle softly, the sound amplified in the silence that had overtaken the room. "Funny thing," I continued, keeping my tone casual yet loaded with tension, "the original will shows an entirely different picture, one that doesn't exactly align with your version, does it?" My words were measured, but each syllable carried the force of revelation. Margaret's eyes widened imperceptibly, and the faintest quiver ran through her hand as she reached for the envelope again, perhaps instinctively attempting to reclaim authority. But it was too late. The lie had been uncovered. The children, sensing the intensity, leaned forward slightly, curiosity mingled with apprehension. Emily's small voice broke the silence, asking, "Mom, is she lying?" Jake's eyebrows knit together, his frown betraying his understanding that something serious had just happened. I smiled softly at them, my gaze reassuring, a silent promise that the truth was on our side. Mark exhaled sharply, tension leaving his shoulders in a rush of relief and disbelief. "Mom, how could you?" he whispered, though not to shame her yet, more to process the betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight for years. His eyes darted between the real Will and Margaret, the contrast undeniable. The room was tense, the air charged, as if every second had stretched into eternity. Margaret, however, struggled to maintain composure. Her perfect smile, the one she had wielded like a shield for decades, faltered just enough to reveal a flicker of panic. I stood slowly, letting my movements draw attention to the paper in my hand. "You see," I said, keeping my voice even, measured, and controlled, "the inheritance was always meant to honor my father-in-law's intentions. He wanted fairness, transparency, and to avoid the kind of manipulation we see right here." The words hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. Margaret's eyes darted from me to Mark, then to the children, realizing, perhaps too late, that the narrative she had controlled for so long was collapsing under the weight of truth. She tried to interject, her voice rising slightly. "Well, I only wanted what was," but I interrupted softly yet firmly. "You wanted what was best for you, Margaret. That much is clear." The words cut through her carefully constructed facade. The children's wide eyes watched the exchange, Emily squeezing my hand gently, as if drawing reassurance from my confidence, while Jake leaned closer to Mark, silently registering the shift in power. Margaret's posture stiffened. Her hand, which had so confidently rested on the envelope moments ago, now trembled slightly as she withdrew. The room seemed to close in around her, every glance from us, every movement of the children, a subtle reminder that her authority was no longer absolute. Her mind raced, no doubt calculating what she could say, what story she could spin, but the truth had already claimed its place at the center of the table. I walked closer to the envelope she still clutched, placing the real will beside it. The contrast was undeniable. Every alteration she had made, every word she had manipulated to favor herself and my brother-in-law, now lay exposed against the original, unaltered version. I could see the moment she realized that her deception was not subtle enough to escape scrutiny, that her carefully constructed lies had been anticipated and outmaneuvered. Margaret's eyes flickered with disbelief, panic, and beneath it all, a faint recognition that the game she thought she controlled had been lost. Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it firmly, grounding me in the moment. The children, sensing victory in the room without fully understanding the stakes, began to relax slightly. Emily let out a small, relieved laugh, while Jake released a deep breath he had been holding unknowingly. Even amidst the tension, there was a palpable sense of justice unfolding. Margaret, however, remained frozen, the perfect mask of composure fractured just enough to reveal the storm beneath. The envelope she had so confidently brought into our home now seemed almost comical in her trembling hands. What had been intended as a weapon, a tool of control and manipulation, had become nothing more than a relic of failed deception. I held the original will with deliberate care, allowing its presence to speak louder than any words could. Every detail of the inheritance, every clause, every line that had been altered in her version, now proved the extent of her manipulation and her miscalculation. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her usual confidence replaced by the weight of exposure. The room was still charged with tension, yet there was a new energy now, a quiet satisfaction, a sense of justice taking root. I glanced at Mark, who gave me a subtle nod, and at the children, whose innocent faces reflected trust and relief. Margaret, for the first time, realized that the truth could not be hidden, that her lies, no matter how meticulously constructed, had been turned against her. And in that moment, standing in the glow of the Christmas lights, surrounded by family and the warmth of home, I understood the power of preparation, patience, and observation. The lie had been discovered, and the balance of control had shifted. Margaret's shocking statement, meant to dominate and manipulate, had instead revealed her vulnerability. And yet, as her eyes darted nervously between us, I knew the night was far from over. The truth had been revealed, but the drama, the tension, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The air in the living room felt heavy, dense, as if every breath carried the weight of unspoken words, shattered trust, and long-buried resentment. Margaret's expression, frozen in disbelief just moments ago, now seemed smaller, less imposing, her usual aura of control slipping like sand through her fingers. I sank into a chair, the reel was still resting in my hands, the crisp paper a stark reminder of both the deception and the truth. Emily and Jake huddled close to Mark and me, seeking reassurance and understanding, their eyes reflecting the confusion and concern of children witnessing the subtle complexities of adult betrayal for the first time. Mark ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, attempting to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. I can't believe she did this, he murmured, his voice tight with anger, disappointment, and disbelief. He glanced toward Margaret, who sat rigid in the chair across the room, Pearl slightly askew, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. Every ounce of composure she had relied on for years seemed to crumble under the weight of her exposure. The contrast was stark, the calm, collected woman we knew on the outside, now undone by the undeniable truth. I looked at the children, whose innocent faces mirrored a mixture of fear and curiosity. Emily's small voice quivered slightly as she asked, "Mom, why would she lie?" I took a deep breath, kneeling to bring myself to her eye level. "Sometimes, people make choices that aren't fair," I explained gently, keeping my voice calm and reassuring while allowing the reality of deception to sink in. They try to take more than they deserve, or they try to control things that aren't theirs to control. Her eyes widened, absorbing the lesson, and Jake leaned closer, silently processing the reality that someone he trusted could manipulate the situation so dramatically. Margaret, sensing the shift in the room, attempted to defend herself, her voice quivering with both anger and fear. "I only did what I thought was best for the family," she exclaimed, a desperate attempt to reclaim authority. But the words fell flat. They lacked conviction because the evidence, the original will, now stood before everyone as a silent judge. Her actions were laid bare, and every attempt at justification felt hollow, weak, and unconvincing. I could see the subtle panic in her eyes as she realized the extent to which her influence had diminished in a single, quiet moment. Mark finally spoke, his tone firm, controlled, yet tinged with barely contained emotion. You had no right to manipulate this, Mom. The inheritance, the will, that was meant to honor Dad's intentions, not yours. Your decision to hide the truth, it's a betrayal. Each word landed with precision, echoing through the room, reverberating against the carefully hung decorations, the sparkling ornaments, and the warm glow of the candles. Margaret's hands twitched slightly, the pearl bracelet sliding down her wrist, a small sign of her unraveling composure. I observed Margaret closely. Her mind was racing, calculating, searching for a way to regain control, but the room had already shifted. Her lies had been exposed, and the family's awareness of her manipulation had grown sharper in an instant. Even the children, though young, seemed to sense the gravity of her actions. Emily clutched a small ornament, pressing it tightly to her chest as if holding onto a fragment of stability, while Jake's wide eyes flitted between us and Margaret, absorbing the emotional dynamics swirling around him. The betrayal was complex, layered in years of subtle control, manipulation, and deception. Margaret had carefully constructed scenarios to ensure she maintained dominance, using small gestures, words, and omissions to shift perception in her favor. The Christmas tree, the gifts, the seating arrangements, all had been elements of her subtle strategy. Now, however, each layer of manipulation had been peeled back, revealing the raw truth underneath. I could feel the tension release in small increments, a slow unraveling that was both satisfying and deeply unsettling. Mark and I exchanged a glance, an unspoken agreement passing between us. The priority now was to support the children, to stabilize the family, and to ensure that Margaret could not further manipulate the situation. Yet beneath that practical concern, there was a simmering current of indignation. Her betrayal had struck at the core of our family's trust, our sense of fairness, and the emotional security we had fought to cultivate. Every ornament on the tree, every carefully arranged gift, suddenly felt like a symbol of the balance she had tried to tip in her favor. Margaret's face betrayed the realization that her efforts to control the narrative had failed spectacularly. The envelope she had so proudly brought into our home now lay useless, a hollow artifact of her deceit. Her attempts at charm and justification faltered, leaving her exposed to the quiet scrutiny of her family. Every glance from Mark, from me, and even from the children, chipped away at the facade she had relied on for years. I noticed the subtle way her shoulders slumped, the slight tremor in her hands, the fleeting shadow of doubt crossing her face, all signs of a woman confronting the consequences of her actions in real time. I took a deep breath, letting the moment stretch, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle fully into the room. You see, Margaret, I said softly, yet with unmistakable authority, truth has a way of coming out, no matter how carefully it's hidden. The statement, though simple, carried the culmination of years of observation, planning, and quiet preparation. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and she averted her gaze briefly, a subtle acknowledgement that her control over the family had been decisively challenged. The children, sensing the emotional shift, began to relax slightly. Emily's small hand rested gently on mine, seeking reassurance, while Jake allowed himself a tentative smile, reflecting the subtle relief of knowing that the truth had emerged. Mark exhaled, a long, slow release of tension, and I could see the first flickers of trust and stability returning to our home. The room was no longer dominated by the heavy weight of deception, but by the quiet assertion of truth and the slow, steady process of processing the betrayal. Margaret, now subdued, seemed smaller in the glow of the Christmas lights. The carefully constructed aura of dominance had dissolved, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. I observed her closely, noting the subtle micro-expressions, the tightening around her eyes, the faint tremor in her voice, the hesitation in her movements. These small details revealed the depth of her internal reckoning, a silent acknowledgement that the lie she had carried so proudly was no longer hers to control. As the evening progressed, we worked silently to process the betrayal together. The children's questions, their innocent curiosity, were met with calm explanations and gentle reassurance. Mark and I discussed the implications quietly, acknowledging the emotional impact while reinforcing the importance of fairness and integrity. Margaret, still present but now quieter, seemed to retreat into her own thoughts, perhaps realizing that the power she had wielded so effortlessly had been irrevocably challenged. The Christmas lights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the room, each one a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the weight of deception. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the space with warmth, yet beneath that warmth lingered the cold reality of betrayal and its emotional toll. Every ornament, every gift, every carefully placed detail of the holiday now carried a dual significance: celebration intertwined with confrontation, beauty shadowed by exposure, family intertwined with the consequences of manipulation. In that quiet aftermath, I realized something profound. Processing betrayal was not about immediate confrontation or punishment. It was about understanding, acknowledging, and responding with clarity, patience, and strength. Margaret's actions had tested the bonds of our family, challenged our integrity, and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet, in the careful navigation of this moment, in the measured responses and steady presence, we found resilience. The lie had been uncovered, the deception had been exposed, and in the heart of our home, surrounded by family, I felt a quiet sense of justice taking root, even as the night's drama continued to unfold. The night had settled into a deceptive calm, the crackling fire throwing dancing shadows across the living room, while outside, the first soft flakes of snow drifted lazily down, coating the world in quiet white. It was a serene picture, yet beneath the surface, the tension in our home was far from resolved. The shock of Margaret's betrayal still lingered in the air like a heavy fog, and the family was processing not just her deceit, but the years of subtle manipulation that had come before. I sank into the armchair, the original will resting on my lap, its crisp edges sharp against my fingers, and let myself breathe for a moment. But my mind was far from calm. It was racing, analyzing, replaying every interaction, every lie, every smirk Margaret had ever directed toward us. Mark sat across from me, his face etched with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and protective instinct. "I can't believe she did this after all these years," he muttered, running his hand through his hair. His eyes, however, held a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could reclaim some control over the chaos she had sown. I nodded slowly, understanding his feelings, yet aware that it would take more than hope. It would take strategy, patience, and precision. This was not just about exposing her, it was about turning the tables, ensuring she understood that manipulation had consequences, and safeguarding our family from future deception. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a brief moment, visualizing the path forward. Every detail of the evening, the envelope, the children's reactions, Margaret's carefully staged arrival, was now a piece of a larger puzzle. I replayed her every word in my mind, analyzing the cadence, the timing, the subtle cues that betrayed her confidence. She had underestimated me, just as she had underestimated the power of preparation, observation, and foresight. That miscalculation was my advantage. I could feel it, a steady hum of resolve building in my chest, an unspoken promise that justice would be served, not with chaos, but with deliberate, precise action. The first step, I realized, was understanding the depth of her deception. Margaret had not merely altered the will. She had cultivated an environment of control, subtly influencing family dynamics over years. Every comment at family gatherings, every manipulation of perception, every carefully planted doubt, it all contributed to her web of power. To counter it, I needed to anticipate her next move, to predict how she might respond to confrontation, and to prepare contingencies that would ensure the truth remained unassailable. The plan had to be meticulous, strategic, and almost surgical in its execution. I glanced at Mark, who was watching me intently, his expression a mix of trust and concern. "We need to be careful," I said, my voice low but firm, carrying both authority and reassurance. "Margaret thrives on chaos. If we rush, if we show too much, she'll manipulate the situation to her advantage. We need patience, observation, precision, He nodded slowly, understanding the stakes. The children were asleep upstairs now, their innocent dreams oblivious to the silent war unfolding in the living room below. That thought strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just acting for myself or Mark. I was acting to protect them, to ensure they never had to bear the weight of Margaret's manipulation again. I began outlining the steps in my mind. First, I would maintain a calm facade, giving nothing away in terms of emotional reaction. Margaret, in her arrogance, would likely continue to attempt subtle intimidation, expecting to provoke fear, guilt, or compliance. I would not give her that satisfaction. Second, I would subtly gather evidence, recorded statements, documented inconsistencies, and any further attempts at deception. Every action she took would be catalogued, a silent testimony to her true intentions. Third, I would orchestrate moments where her lies could be confronted publicly, in front of family or trusted witnesses, ensuring there was no escape from accountability. Every step would be measured, deliberate, and calculated to maximize impact without exposing ourselves to unnecessary risk. I visualized Margaret in the coming days, unaware of the quiet storm building against her. She would continue to act with her usual air of control, but behind the scenes, every move she made would be anticipated, every word considered, every interaction carefully monitored. I imagined presenting the evidence with calm authority, not out of anger, but as a demonstration of truth, a truth she could not manipulate or evade. Her reaction would be one of shock, disbelief, and eventually, reluctant acceptance. The poetic justice of it, her own lies being used to reveal her wrongdoing, was a vision that fueled my determination. Mark leaned forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "You really think we can do this?" he asked, a mixture of hope and caution in his tone. I met his gaze, feeling the unspoken weight of responsibility, the quiet bond of partnership. "Yes," I said firmly. "Not because we want to humiliate her, but because we need to protect our family, preserve fairness, and ensure she can't manipulate anyone ever again. This isn't revenge for the sake of revenge, it's justice." The clarity of that purpose lent strength to the plan, transforming anger into strategy, betrayal into opportunity, and fear into resolve. I considered the timing carefully. Christmas was the perfect backdrop for confrontation, not because of the celebration itself, but because Margaret thrived on the illusion of control. Using that expectation of normalcy as a shield, we could turn her own narrative against her. Every interaction, every conversation, every glance and gesture could be leveraged. I imagined subtly guiding her, creating situations where she would inadvertently reveal inconsistencies, contradictions, or self-serving statements, all while maintaining a composed demeanor that masked the strategic orchestration behind each move. The emotional stakes were high. Margaret's betrayal cut deep, not just because of the altered will, but because of the trust she had abused, the subtle manipulations that had impacted the family over years, and the quiet undermining of Mark and me as parents and partners. Yet, I understood that emotion alone would not be enough. The plan had to be grounded in precision, patience, and careful execution. Each step would be deliberate, a careful blend of observation, restraint, and calculated action designed to restore balance, preserve dignity, and deliver justice without descending into chaos. I envisioned the eventual confrontation in meticulous detail, the evidence laid out with clarity, the children present but shielded from unnecessary emotional strain, Mark standing firmly by my side, and Margaret confronted with the undeniable proof of her deception. The dramatic impact would be undeniable, the tension palpable, and the resolution satisfying not through malice, but through the quiet assertion of truth and fairness. In my mind, I rehearsed every word, every pause, every glance, anticipating her reactions, calculating the optimal responses, and preparing for contingencies. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. The plan was ambitious, delicate, and emotionally charged, yet it was necessary. Margaret had manipulated and deceived for too long. Now, carefully, methodically, and deliberately, it was time to turn the tables. The Christmas lights flickered softly, casting shadows across the room, as if echoing the quiet storm of strategy and resolve building within me. The envelope, once a symbol of her control, now sat inert on the table, a reminder that the power of deception is fragile in the face of preparation and truth. I rose slowly, pacing the room, letting the weight of the plan settle fully into my mind. Every detail had been considered, every potential reaction anticipated, every step designed to achieve the ultimate goal, justice for our family, restoration of trust, and a lesson in accountability for Margaret that she would never forget. The betrayal had been deep, but the response would be deeper, more deliberate, and more powerful than anything she could anticipate. The quiet revenge, the carefully orchestrated dismantling of her manipulative schemes was about to begin. And this time, she would have no escape. The house was buzzing with a quiet, anticipatory energy, the kind that only comes on Christmas Eve when family gathers, decorations glimmer softly, and the promise of a special meal hangs in the air. Outside, the snow fell in lazy, perfect flakes, coating the world in pristine white, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. I moved through the kitchen, arranging silverware, polishing glasses until they caught the light like tiny stars, and straightening napkins folded into elegant shapes. Mark hovered nearby, checking the roast in the oven, while Emily and Jake darted around, excitedly placing ornaments and occasionally sneaking chocolate from the dessert tray. On the surface, it was a perfect picture of domestic bliss, but underneath, every glance, every movement carried the weight of tension, anticipation, and subtle calculation. Margaret, of course, was already present, her presence unavoidable and magnetic. She stood in the corner of the living room, surveying the scene as if she were the director of a grand production in which everyone else was merely a prop. Her pearls gleamed under the warm light, her meticulously styled hair framed her face, and her posture radiated control. She didn't touch anything, didn't interfere, at least, not overtly, but her eyes roamed, calculating, observing, judging every detail, every small imperfection in the arrangement I had so carefully prepared. Her presence was a weight in the room, a quiet assertion of authority that had been honed over decades, and yet, this time I was ready. I met her gaze briefly, offering a polite smile, knowing that the evening would soon become a delicate dance of observation, deception, and subtle power shifts. Mark and I exchanged a brief, silent glance across the kitchen. No words were necessary. The tension between us carried the history of Margaret's manipulation and the unspoken agreement that tonight we would handle her carefully, deliberately. He adjusted the carving knife, hands slightly tense, and muttered under his breath, "It's going to be interesting seeing how she behaves tonight." I nodded, my mind already moving through the scenarios I had planned, the subtle ways in which I would guide interactions, ensuring that her confidence did not translate into control. The children, blissfully unaware of the tension, flitted around us. Emily placed a tiny angel atop the Christmas tree, stepping back to admire her handiwork, while Jake, with a grin, sneaked a candy cane into his pocket before pretending to pin it on the tree himself. Their innocent laughter, light and airy, contrasted sharply with the heaviness in the room, yet it also served as a reminder of why we were doing what we were doing. To protect them, to preserve their sense of security, and to ensure that the manipulations of Margaret could not touch them in the future. Margaret finally stepped forward, crossing the room with deliberate elegance. She adjusted a few ornaments, not because they were crooked, but because she wanted to assert influence, to subtly signal her presence and her authority. "You always make everything so perfect," she said, her voice saccharine sweet, but layered with just enough sarcasm to unsettle. She turned her gaze to me, smiling thinly. "It's almost exhausting, isn't it?" I forced a small, polite laugh, knowing exactly what she was trying to do, make me doubt myself, question my efforts, and feel small in the presence of her seemingly effortless control. But I ignored the bait. I kept my smile steady, my tone calm. Margaret had always relied on emotional manipulation, and tonight it would not work. Mark interjected casually, as if the comment had not even landed. "It's a tradition," he said lightly, placing a hand on my shoulder in support. "The kids love helping, and it's our family's way of celebrating. That's all there is to it." Margaret's eyes flickered briefly, a hint of annoyance passing through her controlled exterior. She opened her mouth to respond, paused, and instead forced a polite smile, sensing, perhaps, that her usual tactics were not as effective in this setting. The children, oblivious to the subtleties, continued their playful tasks. Emily began arranging crackers on the table, while Jake lined up the silverware with exaggerated precision as though it were part of a game. Margaret's attention shifted briefly to them, and for a moment, she softened, not entirely, but enough that I could see the faint traces of maternal pride she occasionally used as a shield for manipulation. Yet underneath, the calculating mind was still at work, assessing, analyzing, and searching for ways to regain influence. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room, setting out plates and candles with deliberate care. The warm glow of the candles reflected off the polished surfaces, creating pockets of light and shadow that seemed almost symbolic of the hidden truths and subtle manipulations at play. Every placement was intentional. The spacing of the glasses, the alignment of the silverware, even the angle of the chairs, all designed to create harmony, to visually assert a sense of order, and, subtly, to signal control in a way that Margaret could not easily manipulate. Margaret finally took a seat, gracefully, yet with an air of superiority. She folded her hands on her lap, glancing around, her eyes occasionally narrowing as she noted small imperfections, deliberate or otherwise. "I see you've been busy," she said, her tone sweet, yet carrying the unmistakable undercurrent of judgment. "Everything looks, well, exactly as you like it." I smiled, neutral, and continued arranging the final touches. Her attempt to provoke a reaction, to assert authority over the preparations, failed to elicit more than calm efficiency on my part. I could feel her frustration simmer just beneath the surface, a subtle energy that I knew could be harnessed in the next stages of the evening. Mark poured wine for the adults while I carried out the final tray of appetizers. The children ran ahead, placing the plates with excitement, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon bread wafted through the air. Margaret leaned slightly forward, scrutinizing everything, her expression one of subtle evaluation. "I suppose this will be an enjoyable evening," she said carefully, her words polite but laced with expectation. I kept my smile steady, offering no confirmation, no acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. The tension in her tone betrayed her awareness that her usual dominance was tenuous tonight. The room settled into a rhythm, small conversations filling the spaces between movements. Mark chatted casually with the children about their favorite Christmas memories, guiding them away from any discussion of the will or inheritance, while I continued to arrange the table, ensuring that every plate, glass, and napkin was positioned perfectly. Margaret's eyes followed my every move, occasionally flicking to the envelope she had placed subtly out of sight, the one she believed still held power. I could sense her impatience building, the careful veneer of calm she projected starting to crack in small, almost imperceptible ways. I moved closer to the fire, adjusting logs so that the glow spread evenly across the room. "Everything's looking beautiful," Margaret said again, almost reluctantly, her voice carrying a mix of praise and veiled challenge. I smiled politely, acknowledging her words without giving her an inch of emotional leverage. It was a delicate balance, showing respect without yielding control, maintaining composure while subtly asserting authority. The children, still laughing and playing, created a lively backdrop, the innocence of their joy highlighting the contrast between family warmth and Margaret's undercurrent of manipulation. As we all settled into the living room, waiting for dinner to begin, the subtle psychological chess game intensified. Margaret adjusted her posture, shifted slightly in her chair, and observed each of us carefully, while I positioned myself strategically, ready to guide interactions, to respond subtly, and to prepare for the moment when the evening's true confrontation would begin. Each glance, each movement, each word exchanged was now part of a larger strategy, a delicate dance of observation, subtle control, and preparation for the eventual revelation. Even the smallest gestures carried significance. Emily offered Margaret a plate, her eyes shining with trust and innocence. Margaret accepted it with a brief nod, a faint flicker of surprise crossing her face at the child's straightforward kindness. Jake, holding a napkin, accidentally brushed against Margaret's chair, and she flinched ever so slightly, a subtle reminder that her composure was more fragile than she liked to admit. Every micro-interaction served as a cue, a breadcrumb in the narrative I was quietly crafting, one that would lead to the ultimate unveiling of truth and justice. The Christmas lights reflected softly on the polished table, creating patterns of shadow and glow that mirrored the tension and anticipation in the room. Every detail, the aroma of dinner, the laughter of children, the subtle shuffling of Margaret's pearls, became part of the stage, part of the preparation for the confrontation to come. I felt the weight of the evening pressing on us, but beneath it all, I carried the quiet confidence of one who has anticipated every move, observed every nuance, and is prepared to act with precision. By the time the first course was served, the room was alive with chatter, yet each conversation was layered with subtext, a delicate interplay of authority, observation, and subtle influence. Margaret attempted a few veiled provocations, questioning seating arrangements, commenting on the lighting, and making small remarks about the decorations, but each time, I deflected calmly, gently guiding the interactions toward stability, while Mark supported the efforts silently, ensuring the children remained insulated from the tension. The scene was set, the family was gathered, the table arranged perfectly, the children laughing lightly, and Margaret, though still confident on the surface, was now operating on fragile ground. The prelude to dinner had become a subtle chess game, a careful testing of boundaries, and a preparation for the ultimate moment when her lies, manipulation, and deceptions would be confronted directly. The stage was ready. All that remained was the moment of truth, the confrontation that would finally reveal the consequences of Margaret's betrayal. The living room had been transformed into what could only be described as a visual masterpiece of festive warmth. Every detail of the Christmas dinner setup was meticulously planned, each element intentionally placed to reflect harmony, celebration, and, subtly, control over the evening. The long dining table gleamed under the soft glow of candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across polished silverware, crystal glasses, and perfectly folded napkins arranged like miniature works of art. Each plate bore intricate designs, carefully chosen to complement the seasonal tablecloth, and the centerpiece, a lavish arrangement of pine cones, holly, and small golden ornaments, commanded attention, drawing the eye to the very center of the room, as though signaling the emotional and symbolic heart of the evening. I had spent hours rehearsing the placement of each item, imagining Margaret's gaze flicking across the table, anticipating every slight smirk or whispered critique she might offer. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a carefully orchestrated stage, designed to subtly assert the family's equilibrium, maintain composure, and subtly foreshadow the confrontation to come. Every ornament on the tree, every shimmer of tinsel, every glow from the candles was intentional, creating an atmosphere of beauty, elegance, and almost hypnotic perfection. The goal wasn't merely aesthetic, it was psychological, a demonstration of balance and calm, juxtaposed against the tension that Margaret carried like a heavy cloak. Mark moved quietly behind me, checking the dishes before placing them carefully on the table. The roast turkey, golden brown and aromatic, was positioned at the head of the table, while side dishes, creamy mashed potatoes, honey-glazed carrots, and rich cranberry sauce, were arranged symmetrically on either side. The scent of the food mingled with a faint aroma of pine from the Christmas tree, creating a sensory tableau that was both comforting and slightly intoxicating, a perfect backdrop for a family evening layered with tension and subtle strategy. The children, Emily and Jake, were responsible for placing the final elements, the cutlery, and the name cards. Emily took her task seriously, adjusting the forks with delicate precision, while Jake, though playful, ensured that each knife and spoon was aligned perfectly, just as I had instructed. Their laughter and small chatter created a light, innocent soundtrack, contrasting sharply with the underlying tension of the adults and highlighting the stakes of the evening, the balance between normal family warmth and the shadow of Margaret's manipulations. Margaret herself moved slowly around the table, her movements deliberate and precise. She adjusted a napkin here, tilted a glass there, her eyes scanning every detail as though seeking imperfections, however minor, to assert authority. Her pearls caught the soft light, shimmering with calculated elegance, and her expression was a careful mix of approval and thinly veiled judgment. "You've outdone yourselves this year," she remarked, her tone dripping with sweetness, though every word carried subtle undertones of scrutiny and expectation. "I can see that a lot of effort has gone into this, even if it's not quite perfect." The words, carefully measured, were designed to unsettle, to provoke, and to remind us that she still believed she held influence over the family's emotions and attention. I smiled politely, acknowledging her comment without allowing it to disrupt the carefully maintained rhythm of the evening. "We wanted everything to be special," I said calmly, letting my voice convey warmth and composure without conceding authority. "It's a family effort, and the children have been excited to help." I gestured subtly toward Emily and Jake, who beamed proudly at the acknowledgement, unaware that they were unwitting participants in a larger psychological interplay between their mother-in-law and us. Margaret's eyes flickered briefly toward them, a trace of calculation crossing her expression. She considered, perhaps, how she might influence their perception of the evening. I caught the movement and filed it away mentally, knowing it would be crucial later in the night. The centerpiece became a focal point, not just as decoration, but as a symbol of careful planning. The golden pine cones and holly weren't merely festive. They were markers of alignment, visually guiding the eye and creating a sense of order that contrasted with the chaos Margaret so often sought to introduce. Candles, spaced evenly along the table, illuminated the polished surfaces, casting shadows that danced across the walls like silent witnesses to the tension slowly coiling beneath the surface. Each element served a dual purpose: aesthetic delight and subtle psychological framing. Mark poured wine into crystal glasses, their delicate rims catching the flickering candlelight, while I placed folded napkins atop each plate, each adorned with a small sprig of holly. The children followed with name cards, their neat handwriting adding an innocent, personal touch to the meticulous setup. Margaret moved to adjust the centerpiece slightly, and I allowed her to do so, not out of concession, but as a controlled act, a calculated allowance to maintain the illusion of her influence while keeping the evening firmly within our orchestration. The tension, though invisible to the untrained eye, was palpable. Every glance Margaret cast was measured, every slight shift of her posture observed, every whispered sigh catalogued. I moved deliberately, ensuring that each action I took reinforced the balance of power subtly yet unmistakably. Every placement of cutlery, every adjustment of the tablecloth, every flicker of candlelight was part of a larger choreography designed to maintain composure, preserve dignity, and prepare for the eventual confrontation. Even the children's excitement contributed to the psychological structure. Emily's delicate placement of glasses, Jake's mischievous adjustments, and their whispered conversations about what presents might be waiting under the tree all served to create a rhythm of normalcy that contrasted with Margaret's poised tension. Their innocence became a shield, grounding the room in warmth and light. Even as subtle undercurrents of manipulation and strategy wove through the interactions. Margaret's behavior oscillated between polite observation and subtle provocation. She complimented the arrangement occasionally, but each compliment was offset with a carefully veiled critique. "The silverware is adequate," she murmured at one point, her voice light yet edged with condescension. I responded calmly, offering a neutral nod, letting the children witness composure rather than confrontation. Each micro-interaction was deliberate, reinforcing the narrative that tonight was controlled, measured, and orchestrated according to careful planning rather than emotional reaction. I adjusted the final centerpiece candle, ensuring its flame illuminated the faces of everyone seated, casting soft, flattering light while symbolically preparing for the moment of truth, the confrontation that would unfold in full view of the family. Mark positioned the roast at the head of the table, a subtle nod to his role as a stabilizing presence. The children completed their tasks, aligning plates and utensils with a meticulousness that highlighted innocence and order in contrast to Margaret's subtle tension. The room was a masterpiece of preparation, both visual and psychological. Every element, the polished silverware, the gleaming glasses, the flickering candlelight, the careful placement of decorations, was designed to assert subtle control, maintain calm, and create a setting in which Margaret's lies, deceptions, and manipulations would be revealed with maximum impact. The stage was set, the actors positioned, and the tension carefully calibrated. Every glance, gesture, and interaction had been considered, analyzed, and strategically framed. As the final touches were completed and everyone took their seats, the living room glowed with warmth, anticipation, and the perfect tension between celebration and confrontation. The Christmas dinner setup was not merely a meal, it was a carefully orchestrated tableau of psychological strategy, emotional anticipation, and dramatic potential. The table, adorned with light, color, and meticulously arranged details, symbolized more than holiday festivity. It represented preparation, observation, and readiness for the pivotal moment when the truth would be confronted and justice quietly enacted. And in that moment, as Margaret adjusted her chair with a careful, deliberate grace, the room held its breath. Every flicker of candlelight, every whisper of conversation, every subtle glance between Mark and me, and every smile of the children contributed to an atmosphere charged with anticipation. The dinner was ready, the stage was set, and the night's events, poised delicately between tradition and revelation, were about to unfold. Margaret believed she held control, but the intricate web of preparation, patience, and observation was about to turn her carefully constructed illusion into the stage of her own undoing. The dining room was radiant under the warm glow of candlelight, the Christmas tree twinkling softly in the corner, yet the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension that hovered over every plate, every fork, every carefully polished glass. The meal had been served with quiet elegance, the children laughing lightly as they exchanged whispers about presents, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. Margaret sat at her place, her posture perfect, her expression calm yet concealing a simmering pride. She believed she still commanded the narrative of the evening. Her pearls glimmered in the soft light, her hands folded delicately on her lap, and her eyes scanned the table with the quiet confidence of someone who thought she held the upper hand. She did not yet realize that the carefully orchestrated plan, months in the making, was about to unravel her with surgical precision. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. My hands rested lightly on the envelope that contained the original will, the document that Margaret had so arrogantly believed she could manipulate. It was crisp, clean, and irrefutable. Every lie she had constructed over years, every subtle manipulation, every whispered half-truth had been recorded, catalogued, and preserved. The culmination of patience, observation, and strategy was now poised for execution. I met Mark's eyes across the table, a silent nod passing between us, a signal that it was time. "Margaret," I began, my voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that drew the room's attention without raising my volume. "You brought this envelope earlier, claiming it contained changes to the will. We all assumed you had the family's best interests at heart." My gaze met hers directly, unwavering, as she offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She shifted slightly in her chair, sensing perhaps that her position was not as unassailable as she had believed. Mark leaned slightly forward, adding weight to my statement. "We were surprised when you said you had hidden the will for a reason. We wanted to trust your judgment, Mom." But his voice trailed, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. Margaret's eyes flickered, a subtle tightening around her jawline betraying the first cracks in her composure. She opened her mouth to speak, but I gently raised a hand to pause her. "I think it's important for everyone here," I continued, "to see the truth." I lifted the envelope slowly, deliberately, letting the flickering candlelight glint off the edges, drawing the family's attention. "The will you altered, the inheritance you tried to redirect, has been preserved exactly as Dad intended. The original document is here." I placed it on the table, directly in front of Margaret, the weight of the paper more than symbolic. It was a physical representation of the justice she had attempted to subvert. A flicker of fear crossed her face, though she masked it quickly with a forced, calm smile. I don't understand," she murmured, her voice tight, betraying the panic she tried to conceal. "I thought I was protecting the family's interests." Her words, though carefully constructed, lacked conviction. The room seemed to absorb the tension, holding it in a suspended state as everyone awaited the next move. I reached calmly for my phone and tapped a few buttons. "We also have a record of your statements earlier today, Margaret," I said, glancing at her with controlled intensity. "When you claimed to have hidden the will for a reason, those words were recorded verbatim. You stated that you altered the inheritance to favor yourself and Jake." The air in the room shifted, heavy with anticipation. Margaret's eyes widened imperceptibly, her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized that her manipulation had been meticulously documented. Emily and Jake exchanged glances, their innocent faces reflecting a dawning comprehension of what was happening. Emily whispered softly to Jake, Mom's calm, but she's serious. The children were perceptive, noticing the subtle shift in energy around the table, the tension that no ornament or candlelight could hide. Margaret's fingers flexed around the edge of her napkin, her knuckles white as the room waited for her response. I only wanted what was fair, she said, voice shaking slightly now, betraying her growing panic. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. The words felt hollow, empty against the weight of evidence and the careful orchestration of the evening. I shook my head slightly, my voice steady and measured. Fair? You hid information, altered documents, and attempted to manipulate the inheritance to serve your own interests. That is not fairness, Margaret. That is deception. Mark's voice joined mine, firm and controlled. Mom, you tried to control the narrative, and for a moment, it might have worked. But the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how carefully it's hidden. The family, now fully attentive, absorbed the words with a mixture of shock, realization, and curiosity. Margaret's carefully curated composure began to crack. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her hands trembled just enough to reveal the fear beneath the polished exterior. I slowly opened the envelope, extracting the original will with deliberate care. This document, I said, letting the words linger, represents Dad's intentions unaltered. Every provision, every decision he made about his estate is preserved exactly as he wanted. And because of careful observation and preparation, your attempts to deceive have been fully documented. I placed the will on the table in plain sight, ensuring that everyone present could see it, including the children. Margaret's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, searching for a response that could salvage her dignity. Her eyes darted around the table, meeting the unyielding gazes of Mark, Emily, Jake, and myself. For the first time, she was truly confronted, not with anger, but with the undeniable truth. The power she had wielded for years, carefully cultivated through manipulation and charm, had evaporated in an instant. The room, bathed in warm candlelight, felt colder, heavier, more intense, the tension of deception replaced by the clarity of revelation. Emily, ever perceptive, tilted her head slightly and asked, Mom, is this really the truth? I smiled gently, leaning toward her, offering reassurance while keeping Margaret's reaction in full view. Yes, Emily. The truth has been preserved, just as Dad wanted. The innocence in her voice contrasted sharply with the gravity of the revelation, highlighting the emotional stakes for the entire family. Margaret's hands shook as she reached instinctively toward the envelope, as if by touching it she could somehow reclaim control. But Mark and I remained poised, unflinching, the subtle assertion of authority clear in every gesture. The room felt suspended, every breath measured, every heartbeat echoing in the shared awareness that a profound shift had occurred. The carefully constructed web of deceit had been dismantled, and Margaret had no room to maneuver. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice calm yet commanding. You wanted to hide the truth, Margaret, and you tried to control the outcome. But your lies have been exposed, your intentions laid bare, and the family has witnessed it all. The words carried the weight of years of observation, strategy, and emotional labor. Margaret's gaze dropped to the table, her facade crumbling entirely. The polished exterior, the pearls, the carefully measured words, all could not withstand the quiet, deliberate force of truth. The room was silent for a moment, the children's eyes wide, Mark's jaw tight with restrained emotion, and Margaret frozen in disbelief. The revelation had been complete, the deception fully exposed, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Every ornament, every candle, every decorative element around the table now seemed symbolic of the dramatic unmasking of control and manipulation, a visual backdrop to the quiet but undeniable victory of truth over deceit. As the realization fully settled over Margaret, she remained seated, her posture rigid yet vulnerable, her eyes flicking briefly between the family members who had long endured her subtle control. I could see the comprehension dawning, the acknowledgement of defeat, and the first glimmers of remorse, or perhaps shock, beginning to seep through. The children, sensing both the intensity and the resolution, leaned slightly closer, understanding that this moment would define their family in ways they would never forget. The revelation was complete. Margaret's lies had been dismantled, her manipulation rendered impotent, and the family had reclaimed control. And yet, as I observed her frozen in the aftermath, a sense of anticipation lingered in the air, an unspoken question of what she might attempt next, how she would respond to the undeniable proof of her actions, and how the rest of the evening would unfold now that the truth had finally surfaced. The moment the truth hung in the air, the room seemed to pause, each flicker of candlelight and shimmer from the Christmas ornaments frozen in time as Margaret absorbed the full weight of the revelation. Her hands, once neatly folded in a deliberate display of composure, now trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness she could not conceal. The envelope containing the original will lay between us like a silent judge, the tangible evidence of her manipulation and deception staring back at her. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, as if trying to recalibrate her thoughts, searching for words that could somehow reclaim control, or at least save a shred of dignity in front of the family. Her eyes darted from Mark to me, then to the children, their wide-eyed curiosity and innocence only amplifying the weight of the moment. Emily leaned slightly forward, tilting her head as she whispered to Jake, "Mom, why is she so quiet?" Jake shrugged, sensing the tension but not fully understanding the intricacies of adult betrayal. Margaret's gaze flicked sharply to them, a fleeting flash of defensiveness crossing her face before she attempted to mask it with a practiced, polite smile. The effort was transparent, and the room collectively recognized the dissonance between her appearance of calm and the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. I didn't realize," Margaret stammered, her voice wavering. "I thought I was doing the right thing." The words were frantic, unpolished, and desperate, a stark contrast to her usual controlled, manipulative tone. The polite veneer she had cultivated over decades had cracked, revealing a vulnerability that few had ever seen. It was the immediate consequence of exposure. The sudden, unfiltered realization that her lies, her subtle machinations, and her attempts at dominance had all been dismantled with quiet precision. Mark leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mom, the will is preserved exactly as Dad intended. Your attempts to redirect it were unnecessary and unfair. We all trusted you to act in the family's interest, but you chose otherwise." Each word landed deliberately, measured in tone, cadence, and emotional weight. Margaret's eyes flickered, betraying a mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and the first hints of regret. She attempted to respond again, opening her mouth, only to find herself without the armor of confidence she had long relied upon. I moved slightly closer, maintaining eye contact with her, the warmth in my voice belying the authority behind it. "Margaret, you have always believed that control was power. But tonight, the truth is power. The family sees it now, and there is nothing you can say to change it." My words were deliberate, punctuated with the calm conviction of someone who had spent months anticipating this exact moment. I watched as her face flickered, her usual smugness replaced by shock, then by a tension-filled pause that betrayed her growing panic. Her breathing became uneven, small, almost imperceptible shivers running through her hands as they rested on the table. The children, sensing that something monumental had occurred, drew slightly closer to me and Mark, their instinctual trust in parental guidance acting as a shield against Margaret's destabilizing presence. Emily whispered softly, "Mom, what's going to happen now?" I offered a gentle smile, bending slightly so my eyes met hers. "We're okay, sweetie. Everything is under control." Her small nod and exhale of relief highlighted the emotional divide between the innocence of childhood and the complicated, tense reality of adult deception. Margaret's lips pressed tightly together as she shifted in her chair. For the first time, her meticulous poise wavered entirely. She opened her mouth again, attempting a defense, a justification, but it came out fragmented, breathless, a mixture of panic and desperation. I thought, she faltered, realizing that no explanation could undo what had been revealed. The room held its collective breath, each family member acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. Her attempts to reassert control were futile. The narrative had shifted irrevocably, and she was now reacting to a reality she had never anticipated. I placed a hand gently on the envelope, drawing her gaze once more. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said softly but firmly, letting the weight of my calm conviction anchor the moment. "The original will, unaltered, and every action you took to manipulate it has been documented. Your attempt to deceive has been exposed." Margaret's eyes widened, her face paling slightly as she absorbed the full significance of my words. Her composure, always her armor, was shattered, leaving her vulnerable and exposed in a way she had not experienced in decades. Mark's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Mom, you've lost the illusion of control tonight, but the family remains intact, stronger than ever. That is what truly matters." Margaret's shoulders slumped, a faint tremor passing through her posture. She tried to straighten them, tried to regain the dignity she so prized, but the room had already witnessed the unraveling. Every detail, from the polished silverware to the flickering candlelight, now reflected not just the elegance of the dinner, but the precision of the exposure, the subtle orchestration that had led to this moment of undeniable truth. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft clink of utensils as Emily adjusted her napkin and Jake's whispered curiosity. Margaret's eyes, darting around the table, seemed to search for an escape, a way to regain control, a way to rewrite what had been revealed. But the evidence was absolute, the family aligned, and her presence no longer dictated the emotional rhythm of the evening. She was a silent witness to her own unraveling, caught in the immediate aftermath of deception laid bare. I could see the internal struggle in her expression, the battle between denial, shame, and the instinct to defend herself. Her carefully constructed persona, built over years of subtle manipulation, was under siege by a combination of truth, observation, and emotional intelligence. Every flicker of her eyes, every subtle clenching of her jaw, every shallow inhale communicated the intense psychological impact of immediate exposure. The family, while composed, absorbed the gravity of her reaction, sensing both the fragility of her control and the quiet authority that had replaced it. Margaret finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to release a fraction of the tension she had carried for years. Yet her eyes remained wide, fixed on the envelope, the children, Mark, and me in turn. She did not speak again immediately, the room thick with unspoken acknowledgement. Her lies had been dismantled, her control neutralized, and the family had emerged intact, stronger and wiser. And in that charged silence, it was clear, though Margaret's immediate reaction had been shock, disbelief, and tentative regret, this moment was only the beginning of the emotional reckoning that the evening would unfold. The candles flickered once more, shadows stretching across the table, highlighting the expressions of each family member. Emily and Jake, now quiet but attentive, sensed the significance of the confrontation, even without fully grasping the details. Margaret remained seated, rigid and stunned, the polished facade of authority replaced by the stark reality of exposure. The room was alive with tension, anticipation, and the quiet satisfaction of justice carefully, deliberately delivered. Even now, in the immediate aftermath, the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Margaret's presence, once dominant, was tempered by the undeniable truth. The family, bound together by resilience and shared understanding, had witnessed the immediate consequences of deception, and the evening, while far from over, had already marked a decisive turning point. Every breath, every glance, every subtle gesture from this moment forward would carry the imprint of the revelation, the recalibration of control, and the first whispers of the subtle, quiet vengeance that had been long in preparation. The room was silent now, the quiet almost deafening after the storm of confrontation that had shaken the Christmas dinner to its very core. Candlelight flickered softly across the table, reflecting off the crystal glasses and polished silverware, now symbols not just of festive celebration, but of justice served. Margaret sat frozen, her fingers pressed lightly against the edges of the envelope containing the original will, her eyes wide, unblinking, and filled with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning comprehension of her own failure. For the first time in years, she had no manipulations to lean on, no subtle words to twist, no hidden documents to leverage. She was exposed entirely, and the consequences of her deceptions were settling in like a heavy, suffocating weight. I exhaled slowly, feeling a wave of relief ripple through me, knowing that the tension that had been building for months, the constant vigilance, the subtle psychological battle, the careful preparation, had finally reached its climax. Mark placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his touch warm and grounding, a silent acknowledgement that we had navigated this treacherous emotional landscape together. "It's over," he whispered, though the word felt almost inadequate given the gravity of the events that had unfolded. Margaret's attempts at influence had crumbled, leaving a void in her confidence and authority that could not easily be reclaimed. The children, Emily and Jake, now understood that the dinner had been about more than food, decorations, or holiday tradition. It had been a lesson in honesty, integrity, and the importance of standing firm against deceit. Emily's small voice broke the silence. "Mom, was she really going to take everything?" I nodded gently, careful not to over-explain, letting the weight of reality speak for itself. "She tried to manipulate things, but we made sure that the truth came out. Dad's wishes were respected, and that's what matters most." Her wide eyes reflected a combination of relief and dawning comprehension, while Jake nodded in quiet agreement, sensing the seriousness of the night even without fully grasping every detail. Margaret's face, now pale and tense, showed the unmistakable traces of emotional unraveling. Her lips trembled as she attempted to compose herself, yet the room was filled with the echo of her failure. The confidence she had relied upon for years, the subtle threats, the manipulation of perception, the careful cultivation of family dynamics, had evaporated in an instant. She shifted in her chair, a subtle but unmistakable tremor in her hands betraying her inner turmoil. Each passing moment reinforced the reality that the evening's events were irreversible. Mark and I exchanged a subtle glance, a silent conversation of shared understanding and quiet triumph. We had not sought to humiliate Margaret publicly, nor had we acted with malice. Our goal had been preservation of truth and family unity, but the meticulous preparation, the careful orchestration of the Christmas dinner, had allowed justice to assert itself in a way that was both satisfying and instructive. The children, unaware of the full complexity of adult deception, were nonetheless absorbing the emotional energy of the room, the tension, the resolution, and the subtle empowerment that comes from standing firm against unfairness. Margaret finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as if testing whether the words could undo the reality that surrounded her. I didn't know." The statement, incomplete and fractured, encapsulated both disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement. There was no grand explanation, no attempt to rationalize or manipulate. For the first time, she faced unfiltered truth. Her lies, her subtle schemes, her quiet manipulations had all been revealed, catalogued and neutralized. The emotional weight of her failure hung visibly around her, a tangible presence that filled the room with quiet tension. I felt a surge of empathy mixed with the quiet satisfaction of seeing fairness restored. While Margaret's actions had been wrong, her immediate emotional unraveling revealed the complex layers of human behavior, the fear of losing control, the shame of exposure, the vulnerability behind a lifetime of carefully constructed authority. The family had witnessed the consequences of deception firsthand, and in doing so, had reinforced a collective understanding that truth, patience, and strategic calm could overcome even years of subtle manipulation. Mark reached out, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's arm, not as a gesture of submission or forgiveness, but as a quiet assertion that while the deception had been exposed, family ties were resilient. "Mom, the truth is out, and it's difficult, I know," he said softly. "But we are still a family. We will move forward together, even if the way forward is different from what you expected." The words, carefully chosen, allowed for acknowledgement without condoning her actions, offering a subtle path to emotional reconciliation while reinforcing the consequences of deception. The children, sensing the shift in energy, returned to their seats, their laughter returning slowly but cautiously. Emily placed a hand gently over her own chest, as if grounding herself after the emotional intensity of witnessing adult confrontation. Jake adjusted a chair quietly, looking to me for reassurance. I nodded, offering a small, calm smile. "It's going to be okay. The truth has been preserved, and we are together as a family." Their innocence and trust became an emotional anchor, reinforcing the stability and resilience of the family unit amidst the turbulence of revelation. Margaret, still visibly shaken, drew in a slow breath, attempting to steady her nerves. Her usual composure, carefully honed through years of subtle domination, was fractured, revealing vulnerability she had never publicly displayed. Every gesture, every flicker of expression, spoke of her inner reckoning, the recognition of failure, the quiet acknowledgement of her own deceit, and the dawning comprehension that her influence over the family dynamic had been recalibrated permanently. The room, once charged with anticipation and tension, began to settle into a new equilibrium. Candlelight continued to flicker, casting soft shadows across the table, but the emotional resonance had shifted. Where once Margaret's subtle authority had governed the interactions, there was now a quiet, measured balance, a recognition that while she remained part of the family, the illusions she relied upon had been dismantled, replaced by transparency, truth, and a renewed understanding of boundaries. I observed her carefully, noting each micro-expression, the slight quiver of her lips, the slow blink of her eyes, the tentative way her fingers traced the edge of the table. These small details reveal the full spectrum of emotional aftermath, the shock, the shame, the lingering pride intermingled with realization. It was a study in human response to exposure, a moment both painful and instructive, demonstrating how even those who manipulate and deceive are ultimately confronted with the consequences of their actions. Mark and I exchanged another glance, a subtle nod that communicated mutual acknowledgement of a job carefully executed. Justice had not been loud or dramatic. It had been quiet, methodical, and undeniable. Margaret's reaction, while emotionally charged and immediate, was contained within the boundaries of family decorum, and yet the weight of understanding and accountability had already begun to settle over her. Emily and Jake, still processing, looked to us for guidance, absorbing the subtle lessons of integrity, patience, and the importance of defending truth in the face of deception. The emotional energy in the room had shifted from confrontation to reflection, from tension to quiet resolution. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, the envelope now a silent testament to the evening's revelations, her emotional state a complex mixture of vulnerability, embarrassment, and reluctant comprehension. As the evening drew on, the family began to navigate the new dynamic cautiously, yet confidently. Conversations resumed, soft and tentative at first, then gradually more natural. Margaret's eyes occasionally flickered toward the will, a mixture of lingering disbelief and contemplation visible in her gaze. The children, sensing both tension and stability, returned to their activities, their laughter slowly threading through the room once again. The emotional aftermath was palpable, a delicate balance of relief, empowerment, and subtle caution, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the family story, one where truth had prevailed, deceit had been exposed, and silent, quiet justice had been delivered with care and precision. The room had quieted to a gentle hum, the soft sounds of clinking silverware and the muted laughter of Emily and Jake threading delicately through the air, yet an invisible tension lingered like a shadow over the beautifully set Christmas table. Every ornament on the tree reflected not only the festive glow of the season, but also the weight of the evening's revelations. Candles flickered softly, casting elongated shadows across the walls, as if mirroring the subtle yet undeniable shift in the family's dynamics. I sat back slightly, hands resting lightly in my lap, allowing myself a quiet moment to observe the aftermath, the lingering ripples of justice, deception, and emotional reckoning that had defined this extraordinary night. The children were absorbed in their own world of innocent excitement, occasionally stealing glances at Margaret, whose every movement betrayed the tension still trapped beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Margaret sat rigidly at her place, her hands lightly gripping the edges of the table, the envelope containing the original will positioned like an unspoken monument to the evening's drama. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward Mark and me, a mix of disbelief, unease, and perhaps a touch of shame reflected in the subtle flickers of her gaze. She seemed caught between comprehension and denial, her carefully constructed persona fractured, leaving her vulnerable in a way that few had ever witnessed. The once commanding presence she wielded like armor over decades of family interactions now seemed diminished, as though the weight of truth had drained the color from her carefully cultivated authority. I took a slow breath, letting the emotional energy of the room settle gently into a rhythm of reflection. The events of the evening, the revelation of her lies, the confrontation with the altered will, the immediate reaction, and subsequent emotional aftermath, had shifted not only the tangible power dynamics, but also the invisible, psychological currents that had long shaped our family's interactions. It was a moment of clarity, of equilibrium, and of subtle yet undeniable empowerment for the rest of us. The children, innocent yet perceptive, were learning a quiet lesson about integrity, justice, and the importance of standing firm even when deception comes from those closest to you. Mark reached across the table, offering a gentle squeeze to my hand, a silent acknowledgement that the long months of careful observation, preparation, and quiet planning had culminated in this precise moment. His eyes met mine, and I could see the mirrored mixture of relief, quiet triumph, and cautious optimism. "It's over," he murmured softly, the words carrying the weight of the entire evening. Indeed, in a way, it was over. The immediate confrontation, the exposure of deception, and the preservation of Dad's intentions had all reached a satisfying conclusion. Yet the undercurrents of emotion, the subtle tensions, and the psychological consequences would linger far beyond this night. Margaret, still visibly shaken, drew a slow breath and finally allowed herself a faint sigh, a subtle release of the pent-up tension that had defined her immediate reaction. Her shoulders, previously rigid and commanding, slumped slightly, betraying a quiet acknowledgement that the balance of control had irrevocably shifted. The subtle tremor in her hands, the tightness around her eyes, the careful modulation of her voice, all reflected the long-term impact of exposure, not just on her authority, but on her perception of her own influence within the family. For the first time, she was confronted not with external judgment, but with an internal reckoning, the realization that deception, no matter how skillfully executed, eventually yields to truth. Emily, perceptive and thoughtful beyond her years, tilted her head toward me. "Mom, why was she so upset?" she asked softly, her small voice cutting through the lingering tension like a beam of clarity. I smiled gently, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Because, sweetie, she tried to control something she shouldn't have. She hid the truth and changed things for herself, but we made sure the right thing was preserved. Sometimes, when people face the consequences of their actions, it can be very upsetting, even for adults." Her eyes widened slightly, the innocence of childhood meeting the stark realities of adult behavior, and yet she nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the complex interplay of fairness, truth, and responsibility. Jake, equally perceptive but quieter, leaned back in his chair, his small fingers drumming lightly on the table as he absorbed the nuanced tension of the room. "So, she can't change anything now?" he asked, the simplicity of his words carrying profound implications. I shook my head gently, offering reassurance while allowing the weight of the lesson to remain. "No, Jake. What was done in secret can't undo what's real. The truth is always stronger than lies, and fairness cannot be rewritten once it has been restored." The children's subtle acknowledgement of this principle, even without fully understanding every intricacy, underscored the emotional gravity of the evening. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice subdued, fragile, and almost introspective. I didn't mean to. I thought I was helping." The words, though intended as a defense, sounded hollow against the backdrop of documented deception and the quiet authority that now permeated the room. The subtle quiver in her lips and the tension around her eyes revealed the emotional weight she carried, an acknowledgement of failure, the first stirrings of regret, and a faint recognition of the consequences of manipulation. The dinner, meant to celebrate family and tradition, had transformed into a crucible of accountability and reflection. I allowed a slow, deliberate pause, observing the emotional interplay across the table, the quiet triumph of truth, the lingering vulnerability of deception exposed, and the delicate recalibration of family relationships. The candles flickered once more, their soft light casting shadows that danced gently across Margaret's face, highlighting the subtle lines of worry and reflection etched into her expression. The children, absorbing the tone and energy, sensed the importance of the night's lessons without fully articulating them, a quiet testament to the enduring impact of observed justice and emotional clarity. Mark leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive, reflecting a combination of relief, satisfaction, and cautious vigilance. "We've learned a lot tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying both reassurance and quiet reflection. "About honesty, fairness, and the importance of standing together as a family. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it." His words, measured and deliberate, allowed the family to process both the events and the underlying principles, reinforcing the subtle lessons embedded within the drama of the evening. Margaret's gaze lowered, finally meeting mine briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between us, acknowledgement without full reconciliation, recognition without justification. The tension remained, but it had transformed, softened by truth, tempered by observation, and contextualized by the emotional aftermath of exposure. It was a silent, mutual acknowledgement that the balance had shifted irrevocably, yet the ties of family, though strained, remained intact, resilient, and cautiously optimistic. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the children returning to their playful chatter, Mark and I exchanging a subtle nod of mutual comprehension, and Margaret sitting still, reflective, and visibly altered by the weight of the evening. The Christmas tree sparkled softly in the background, a symbol of tradition and continuity, yet the emotional resonance of the night, the lessons in justice, truth, and accountability, lingered like an invisible echo, shaping the family dynamic in ways that would extend far beyond the holiday season. As I finally allowed myself a slow exhale, I reflected on the journey, the subtle manipulations of the past, the careful orchestration of strategy and patience, and the quiet triumph of exposing deception without shattering the bonds that tied us together. The envelope on the table was no longer just a document. It was a symbol of resilience, of justice preserved, and of the delicate, enduring power of truth in a world where deception often hides behind politeness and tradition. The night would end quietly, the family sharing subdued laughter, thoughtful glances, and cautious conversation. Yet the memory of the revelation, the immediate reaction, and the emotional aftermath would persist, not as bitterness or resentment, but as a lasting testament to the strength of truth, the importance of observation, and the quiet, indelible impact of standing firm in the face of deception. Margaret, still present yet visibly diminished in authority, served as a living reminder that even the most subtle manipulations cannot withstand the enduring power of honesty, preparation, and familial unity. And as the last candle flickered, casting a gentle glow over the room, I realized that the family had not merely survived the night. They had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient, bound together not by unchallenged authority or silent manipulation, but by shared truth, emotional awareness, and the quiet, unwavering triumph of justice finally served.